Whisperbound. Episode 3: The Nexus Choice. The light of the library still shimmered in the narrow corridors, yet Eve could not relax. The words of the fog continued to echo in her mind. The seal is breaking. She knew that every second counted. Lyra had given her a few last clues before she left the underground tunnels in the direction of the workshop. Yet the unease did not fade. The path through the tunnel system was oppressively silent. Even the familiar dampness and the dripping of water now felt threatening. Every step of Eve's boots echoed through the passages, and her heart beat in an unsettled rhythm. The map she'd received from Garrick had become a familiar companion by now. It guided her through the labyrinthine corridors, yet something felt different. The fog was more present, even down here, where it normally did not reach so thickly. Suddenly, Eve stopped. A crackling sound broke through the silence, as though something was sliding through the old metal braces of the tunnels. Her hand moved instinctively to her dagger. She turned slowly, her eyes searching the darkness. "Who is there?" Her voice was calm, but firm. No answer followed, only the echo of her words losing itself in the distance. Yet the crackling remained. It was not a natural sound. It reminded her of the pulsing of the sphere in Garrick's workshop. She gathered her courage and continued on her way, the map held firmly in one hand, the dagger in the other. Yet her thoughts would not leave her in peace. Was the seal truly as close to breaking as Lyra had suspected? And what would happen if it actually broke? When Eve finally climbed the stairs to the workshop, she noticed that the air was heavier than before. The fog pressed through every crack and seemed almost tangible. She pushed open the heavy iron-bound door, which gave way with a creak. Inside the workshop it was dark, and only the faint glow of the sphere on the workbench offered any light. "Garrick!" she called, but no answer came. The workshop seemed abandoned, yet she knew Garrick would never simply leave, especially not while the sphere was here. Eve stepped closer and saw that the engravings on the sphere had changed again. They now glowed in an unsteady rhythm, as though reacting to something. A cold shiver ran down her back, but she forced herself to remain calm. She examined the workshop more closely. Tools lay scattered around as though they had been dropped in haste. On the workbench lay a notebook, Garrick's unmistakable style covering the pages. Eve reached for it and began turning through the entries. "The engravings appear to be connected to the currents of the fog," she read quietly. "The seal is not only a gate, but a focal point. It draws in the foreign forces in order to channel them. If it breaks, the barrier will not merely be weakened, the way will be opened." Her fingers trembled as she turned the page. "I have attempted to stabilize the glow of the engravings, yet every intervention seems to destabilize them further. It is as though the artifact is working against my efforts. Whatever I do seems to bring it closer to the point of collapse." A clatter behind her tore Eve from her thoughts. She spun around, dagger raised. Yet there was nothing to be seen. The fog had pressed farther into the workshop and filled the corners with a living heaviness. "Garrick!" she called again, louder this time. Again no answer came. Instead something moved within the fog. A shadow, difficult to grasp but unmistakably there. Her heartbeat quickened, yet she kept the dagger clenched firmly in her hand. "Show yourself." Her voice echoed through the room, but whatever moved in the fog remained silent. Instead, the crackling grew louder, and the sphere began to glow more intensely. The light distorted the room, and shadows danced on the walls in unnatural shapes. Eve knew she had to act. She stepped closer to the workbench, her eyes fixed on the sphere. Whatever was happening here, it was connected to the artifact. Her fingers hesitated for a moment before she touched the sphere. The cold metal pulsed beneath her hand as though it were alive. In that moment, the room filled with a deep, vibrating tone that shook her entire body. The sphere began to glow brighter and brighter until the light forced her to close her eyes. Then there was a voice. Not like the whispering voices of the fog, but clear and piercing. "You are too late." Eve's eyes flew open, but she saw nothing except the blinding light of the sphere. The engravings now moved faster and formed patterns she could not understand. A scream tore through the workshop, and she did not know whether it came from her or from something else. Then silence followed. Eve lay on the floor, her heart hammering in her chest. It took her a moment to understand that the light of the sphere had gone out. The workshop was plunged into darkness, with only the weak glow of the oil lamps in the corner offering any orientation. She pushed herself upright and felt for her dagger, which had slipped from her hand. Yet something was different. The air seemed thicker and heavier, as though she were not merely breathing it in, but as though something foreign were flowing through her lungs. The fog had grown denser, no longer a mere appearance, but a tangible force. Suddenly, a faint whisper sounded directly behind her. Eve turned sharply, the dagger held before her, but there was no one there. Instead, the shadow on the wall began to move and grow. A figure formed, not entirely human, with unnaturally long limbs and a vague, faceless outline. "Who are you?" Eve asked, her voice trembling slightly. The figure did not move, yet the whispering grew louder and formed broken words. It took her a moment to understand that it was not only one voice, but many. All of them spoke over one another, a choir of fear and anger. "The seal will fall," one of the voices whispered more clearly than the others. "You cannot stop it." Eve felt the cold eating into her body, yet she clung to her courage. "What are you? What do you want?" The figure dissolved and vanished into the fog, but the whispering remained. Then, suddenly, something stirred at the workbench. Eve spun around and saw the sphere begin to live again, its engravings glowing once more. Yet this time something was different. A small crack stretched across its surface, and from it a fine, shimmering light seeped out. "No, not now," Eve murmured and reached for the artifact. Yet the moment her fingers touched it, she felt a wave of force that hurled her back. She slammed into the workbench, pain shooting through her back, but she kept her gaze fixed on the sphere. The whispering turned into a shrill scream, and the fog began to move as though drawn toward the sphere. Eve knew that time was running out. She had to do something before everything slipped out of control. Eve gasped for air as the screaming turned into a droning hum that seemed to pierce the entire workshop. She felt the floor vibrate beneath her, and the fog began to circle the sphere in concentric waves. It was as though the artifact were calling something forth, something that waited only to break through the barrier. "Garrick, where are you?" Eve whispered desperately and forced herself upright. Her legs trembled, but she made herself remain standing. The dagger in her hand was cold, its tip trembling slightly, as though it too were reacting to the uncanny force. A strange light began to spread through the room, a pale violet glow that came from the sphere and drifted across the floor in thin veils. The light revealed details she had not noticed before, runes on the walls that now also seemed to pulse, and a hidden hatch behind the workbench whose outline became visible in the glow. Eve hesitated. The hatch had never been noticeable before, yet she felt that it was connected to what was happening here. She reached for the small crank on the hatch, but before she could turn it, a new voice pierced through the screaming. Unlike the whispering before, this voice was deep and penetrating. It spoke a language Eve did not understand, yet the words carried a power that made her shudder. "What do you want?" She shouted into the darkness, and raised her dagger. Her voice sounded firmer than she felt. The light flickered, and for a moment the screaming lessened. Then something stepped out of the fog. It was no clear shape, but a shimmer, a shadow that seemed to waver between worlds. Instantly, Eve felt the temperature sink further. Her skin tightened, and her breath became clouds of mist. "The seal is broken," the figure said with a voice that sounded as though metal were being dragged across stone. "You cannot stop the flow. It is too late." Eve held her dagger tighter and took a step back until her back touched the workbench. Her eyes flickered between the figure and the sphere, whose light now seemed almost alive. "What are you? What is your purpose?" The figure twisted into a swirl of fog and came closer, though its contours remained unclear. "I am the beginning and the end," it said cryptically. "And you are only one of many." Suddenly, the hatch behind her opened with a loud grinding sound, without her ever turning the crank. A powerful draft surged upward, accompanied by a cold, stinging odor that made Eve's eyes water. The screaming fell silent, and the sphere seemed to freeze for a moment. "This is my only chance," Eve murmured, and reached for the sphere with one hand. The foreign force flooded through her at once. Her breath caught, and she felt a pull inside herself, as though something were trying to tear her apart. Yet she endured it, drew the sphere to her chest, and leapt into the open hatch. The fall was short, but it felt endless. She landed hard on cold stone, the light of the sphere her only point of orientation. Beneath her stretched a vast vaulted chamber whose walls were covered with the same runes she had seen above. Yet here they shone brighter, almost glaring. The figure did not follow her, but the whispering was still there, this time inside her head. "You cannot escape. You are part of the circle." Eve felt her knees weaken, but she forced herself to keep moving. The sphere in her hands began to glow, warmer and brighter than before. She did not know what she had to do, but an instinct drove her farther into the darkness, toward the place where the runes pulsed most strongly. With every step, the air grew heavier. The room opened out into a vast chamber that seemed to have no end. In the center of the room, she finally saw a structure resembling an altar. The runes on its surface pulsed in a chaotic rhythm, and the light of the sphere answered them as though it were part of the same system. "This is the Nexus," Eve whispered. She did not know how she knew it, but the word felt right. The sphere in her hands began to grow hotter, and the glow reached a point where she could hardly bear it. She stepped up to the altar and carefully placed the sphere into a hollow that seemed made for it. The moment she let go, the structure began to vibrate, and a deep rumble filled the room. The runes now shone so brightly that they bathed the chamber in uncanny light. Then the fog began to move. From every direction it streamed toward the sphere and the altar, growing denser and heavier. Eve stepped back, her breathing quickening. From the fog, shadows formed again, clearer and more tangible this time. There were many of them, dozens, and they moved toward her. "This cannot be the end," Eve murmured and drew her dagger. She felt that the moment had come to do something, but she did not know what. The Nexus released an untamed force, and the shadows grew ever denser. Eve knew she had only seconds before she would be overwhelmed. In the midst of the chaos, another light suddenly appeared, a bluish glow breaking out from one of the walls. A figure formed entirely of light stepped forth. It spoke with a voice that was both calm and full of power. "You are not alone, Seeker." The light figure raised a hand, and the shadows hesitated and stopped. "Yet your decision will change everything. The Nexus can be closed or unleashed. Choose wisely." Eve felt the eyes of the light figure resting on her, and a strange peace settled over her. Yet the words echoed in her mind. Closed or unleashed. Time was slipping away, and the choice lay with her. Eve breathed shallowly, her gaze shifting between the light figure and the pulsing sphere on the altar. The fog around her vibrated, and the shadows stood still, yet their restless movements showed that they were waiting only for a single moment of carelessness. The words of the light figure echoed in her mind. The Nexus can be closed or unleashed. Choose wisely. What did wisely mean? Eve felt her thoughts race. The fog, the shadows, the altar, everything seemed connected, yet the answers withdrew from her. She remembered the notes in Garrick's notebook, the seal that held the barrier and the balance between worlds. Yet even there, no choice had ever been mentioned. Why did it have to fall to her? "What happens if I close it?" she asked, her voice trembling, though she forced herself to stand firm. The light figure took one step closer, its shining light pushing back part of the fog. "The barrier will be strengthened," it said, its voice carrying a gentle authority. "But at a price. The force that connects the worlds will flow into the Nexus, and whatever lurks beyond will remain bound for now. But the balance is fragile, and this will not be the end." Eve felt a lump in her throat. "And if I unleash it?" The light figure paused, and for a moment it seemed to hesitate. "The fog will lose its anchor. It will become chaotic, destructive, yet at the same time the seal will reveal its true nature. The knowledge that has long been hidden will become accessible. But this knowledge is no guarantee of victory. Chaos or destruction." Eve whispered more to herself than to the light figure. "That is not a choice. That is a curse." The shadows began to stir, and a faint whispering rose, as though they sensed her doubts. Eve felt time working against her. She had no certainty, no guarantee. All she had was her instinct. She stepped closer to the altar, her hand hovering over the sphere. The glow of the engravings had quickened, and the heat of the artifact radiated in waves. The light figure said nothing more. It waited. The shadows held still, as though they knew this was the moment they had been waiting for. Eve closed her eyes. Images flooded her mind, the workshop, Garrick, the city in the distance wrapped in fog. She saw faces she did not know, and heard voices calling her. It was as though the sphere itself was speaking with her, as though it wanted to show her the way. But was it a path into salvation or into damnation? Her eyes opened. She knew she had to bear the responsibility, no matter what decision she made. She drew in a deep breath, raised her hand, and placed it on the sphere. The room exploded in light. The sphere beneath her hand seemed to shatter, but instead it began to dissolve. Its force flowed into the altar, and from there into the runes covering the walls. A deep droning passed through the room. The floor beneath Eve's feet trembled, and the fog recoiled abruptly, forced back by an unseen power. The shadows retreated, their forms dissolving in the rising brightness, until nothing remained but the pulsing runes and the light of the altar. Eve staggered. The pressure of the force had nearly overwhelmed her body. Yet she stood firm. The light figure was still there, but it had become paler, less tangible. "You've made your choice," it said, and its voice was now quieter and gentler. "The barrier is renewed, but the price was high. What you see now is only the beginning." "What do you mean?" Eve asked, gasping, her voice brittle. "The force of the Nexus is not destroyed. It is bound, but it will always seek a way. You have gained time, Seeker, but no answer." But before Eve could respond, the light figure began to fade. It whispered, "The answers lie beyond this place. Find them before the shadows do." Then it was gone, and Eve was alone. The silence that followed was almost crushing. The altar was cool, the sphere gone. The runes on the walls had stopped glowing, and the chamber was once more plunged into darkness. Eve felt her legs give way, and she sank to the floor. Her breathing came in bursts, and sweat ran down her face. Yet she knew she could not stay. Somewhere above waited a world that did not know what had just happened, and a danger that was far from over. With trembling hands, she pushed herself up and began the long way back to the surface. Her thoughts were tangled as she moved through the tunnels. Had the light figure truly been an ally? What exactly had she gained, and what had she lost? And why did the fog, though it had vanished, still seem to hang in the air as a threat? When she reached the final ladder to the surface, she drew in a deep breath. Her world was no longer the same, and she knew that her role in this game had only just begun. The streets above her were silent, yet it was a strange and oppressive silence. The fog had withdrawn, but it had not disappeared. Instead, an uncanny clarity hung in the air, as though the city were holding its breath. Lights flickered in the distance, and Eve could see small groups of people pressing themselves into the shadows and watching the empty alleys with suspicion. She sensed that the events beneath the surface had not gone unnoticed. Something had changed. The droning that had ended with her decision in the Nexus seemed to have sent a wave of unrest through the city. Buildings seemed older, as though the years had suddenly marked them more deeply. Windows had cracked because they could not withstand the pressure of an invisible force. A dull humming passed through the silence. Eve recognized it at once. It was the same sound she had heard near the Nexus, though weaker and farther away. She followed the sound, her steps careful, her hand on her dagger. In an alley barely touched by light, she found the source. An old man sat on the ground, collapsed and trembling. His lips moved as though he were speaking, but no sound emerged. Around him, the air seemed to vibrate, and when Eve stepped closer, she saw that his eyes glowed with a pale light. "What happened to you?" she asked. But the man did not respond. She crouched down, carefully touched his shoulder, and in that moment his head snapped upward. His eyes fixed on her, and from his mouth came two words: "It comes." Eve shivered as the words rolled through the narrow alley. The old man trembled uncontrollably while the light in his eyes flared for a brief moment and then died. He sagged powerlessly into himself, his breathing heavy and shallow. Eve bent closer to him, her dagger still in her other hand, ready to react to any movement. "What comes?" she asked sharply, but the man no longer seemed conscious. Around him, the air remained strangely charged. She looked around, her senses sharpened, but the alley was empty. Still, she could not shake the feeling of being watched. A faint scratching sounded from the darkness, barely audible, but it made Eve's heart stop for a moment. She straightened, dagger clenched firmly, her eyes searching the shadows. The scratching grew louder and more rhythmic, as though something with long, sharp claws were sliding over stone. Then she saw it. A shadow, little more than a fleeting outline, moved along the wall. It was too fast and too unnatural to be human. Eve felt the familiar cold of the fog close around her again, and she knew the barrier did not fully protect her up here. "Stay back!" she called and raised the dagger. Her voice echoed through the alley, but the shadow did not stop. Instead, it seemed to swell, growing darker and larger until it finally took on a human-like form. The outlines of the figure were distorted, its proportions wrong, and where a face should have been, there was only yawning emptiness. "Seeker," the figure spoke, its voice a deep rumble that vibrated in Eve's chest. "You have shifted the balance. Who are you?" Eve's voice was firm, though her hands trembled. She took a step back, the man on the ground nearly forgotten. All that mattered was the threat before her. The figure did not move, yet the shadow around it pulsed as a living mass. "I am part of what comes," You touched the Nexus and wounded the seal. Now you are bound. Eve's heart raced. Bound to what? The figure did not answer, but its form began to change. Long, thin limbs grew from its body, and its movements became faster and more jerking. There is no way back, it said at last, only forward. With those words, the figure rushed at her. Eve reacted instinctively, throwing herself aside and narrowly avoiding the first strike. The dagger in her hand glowed faintly as though reacting to the darkness. She spun around and struck a quick blow against the figure. The dagger hit something solid, and a sharp, unnatural scream filled the alley. The figure recoiled, its form becoming unstable for a moment, yet it recovered quickly. You are stronger than I expected, it said, its voice now filled with anger. But it is not enough. Eve felt the cold around her increase. Her movements grew heavier, as though the fog itself were holding her in place. She knew she could not win, not alone, yet she also knew that flight was not an option. She had to find a way to weaken the figure. Her eyes searched the surroundings until she discovered an old pitch channel jutting from the wall, one that must once have fed a street flame. A plan formed in her mind. She lured the figure closer, her steps deliberate, while she continued attacking with the dagger to keep it occupied. When the figure was close enough, Eve stepped back, tore the old channel from the wall, and struck it with all her strength. A spark from a broken lantern was enough to ignite the spilled pitch. The flames seized the figure, which collapsed in on itself with a deafening scream. The fog pulled back, and for a moment the alley was still again. Eve panted, her lungs burning from the effort. Yet she knew this had been only a foretaste. Whatever it comes meant, it was larger than what she had just defeated. And it would find her. With trembling hands she lifted the dagger, whose blade now shimmered dully. She turned away and began to leave the alley. She had to find answers, and she knew time was working against her. The fight had only just begun. The night had grown heavier when Eve left the labyrinth of alleys and reached the broader streets of the city. The flickering of oil lamps faintly lit the empty paths, while the fog hung between the buildings. In the distance, she could make out the shape of the main street, where a weak glow suggested that people were still awake. Yet something was different. The air was heavy, not only with fog, but with a tension that almost crushed her. Sounds reached her ears, muffled voices, the striking of metal, the distant creaking of doors. The city was alive, but in a way she was not used to. When she turned a corner, she saw a group of people gathered around a fire. Their faces were pale, their clothes worn, and their movements spoke of exhaustion. One of the men held an improvised weapon, a rusty piece of metal that he nervously waved back and forth when he noticed Eve. "Who goes there?" he called, his voice tense. The others turned, their eyes glowing with suspicion in the firelight. Eve raised her hands, the dagger held loosely in one of them to show that she meant no threat. "I am only passing through," she said calmly. "I am looking for answers." A woman from the group stepped forward, her eyes examining Eve with sharp curiosity. "Answers?" Her voice was rough, though not hostile. "There are no answers left. Only survival. Whatever is happening here has already broken the city." "What do you mean?" Eve asked and stepped carefully closer. She could see exhaustion and fear in the faces of the people, but also a strange determination. The woman shook her head. "You've seen it, have you not? The shadows. They are everywhere. They take those who are alone. We hear the screams, but we can do nothing." A younger man in the group added, "And the fog keeps getting thicker. Some say they see things inside it. Others never come back at all." Eve's thoughts raced. The shadows and the fog seemed to be spreading faster than she had feared. Her decision in the Nexus had changed something, but she did not know whether she had stopped it or hastened it. She had to return to Garrick, to the notes, to the answers she needed so desperately. The group stared at Eve, and for a moment she felt like an intruder in a world she barely recognized anymore. The fog seemed denser, almost alive, as though responding to her presence. Yet she also sensed something else, a kind of hope, as weak as the flickering flames of the fire. "You cannot simply stay here," Eve said at last, her voice penetrating. "The shadows will return. They know you are here." The woman who had spoken before crossed her arms and looked at Eve challengingly. "And where are we supposed to go? The city is no longer safe. Nowhere is." "There are places," Eve began, but then she stopped. Where exactly were they supposed to go? Even the workshop was no longer the safe harbor she had once known. Yet something inside her urged her to keep speaking. "I know someone who can help. An ally. If we manage to reach him, we may find a way to strengthen the barrier, or at least keep the shadows away." The group looked at one another, a mixture of distrust and hope reflected on their faces. The man with the improvised weapon stepped forward. "Who are you to think you can change anything? The city is lost." Eve looked directly at him, her green eyes shining in the firelight. "I am someone who has wounded the balance," she said quietly, "but with force. And I will restore it, whatever it costs." The words hung heavily in the air. After a moment, the woman nodded. "If you can lead us, then we will follow you. But I warn you, we have no strength left for false promises." "I promise nothing," Eve answered. "Only that I will not allow this city to be lost to the fog." The group prepared to gather their few belongings. Eve remained watchful, her senses sharpened. The fog was still, but she knew that meant nothing good. It was the calm before the storm. While the others gathered themselves, the young man who had spoken earlier of the vanished people stepped up to her. "You really fought the shadows?" he asked quietly, his eyes wide with awe. Eve nodded. "Yes, but it was close. They are strong, and they learn quickly. Do you think we have a chance?" His voice trembled, and Eve saw the fear in his eyes, a fear she knew all too well. "As long as we stay together and remain careful, yes," she said, and placed a hand on his shoulder. "But you have to learn to defend yourself. All of us must." He nodded slowly, and a trace of determination entered his face. "Then show me how to fight." Eve wanted to answer, but a distant screech tore through the night. It was high and drawn out, and it made the skin on her arms prickle. The group froze, and all eyes turned toward the direction from which the sound had come. "We have to go now," Eve said sharply. "Stay together and move quietly. We must not draw attention." The group set itself in motion, their steps muffled on the cobblestones. Eve led them through the narrow alleys, always careful to avoid the open streets. The fog grew denser, and the screech returned again and again, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. It seemed as though the shadows were hunting them and testing them at the same time. The city around them seemed ghostly, as though the buildings themselves had absorbed the suffering of the people. Facades were split by cracks, windows lay in shards, and at the corners stood piles of belongings left behind in haste. Eve felt the fog filling her lungs as though it wanted to choke her from within. "Stay close to me," she said over her shoulder, her voice barely louder than the wind. Her eyes searched the shadows lurking between the crumbling walls. A faint crying broke through the silence. It came from a side alley, little more than a whisper in the fog. The group stopped, and everyone stared into the darkness. "What was that?" the young man whispered, his voice shaking. "It could be a trap," said the woman with the improvised weapon, taking one step back. "We should ignore it." Eve shook her head. "If someone is there, We cannot simply look away." She moved carefully toward the alley, her blade ready. The crying grew clearer, a plaintive sound piercing the hardness of the fog. When Eve peered around the corner, she saw a small child collapsed against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. The girl looked pale, as though the fog had hollowed her out. Her eyes were empty, without shine. "Are you alone?" Eve asked gently, but the child did not respond. She took one step forward, but a strange flicker in the fog made her stop. The air moved, and suddenly Eve understood that this was not a rescue, but a trap. "Back!" she shouted, and tore the child to herself as a dark shape burst out of the fog. It was faster and larger than the previous creature, and its form was even less tangible. Its arms lengthened into shadows, whipped through the air and shattered the stones of the alley. The group reacted at once. The woman swung her weapon while the young man threw the axe at the creature. Eve rolled aside, the child held tightly against her, and searched for a point of attack. The figure was wild and chaotic, and the attacks bounced off it as though it had no substance. "We have to get out of here," the woman shouted. "That thing is too strong." "No," Eve said firmly. "If we run, they will follow us. We have to stop it here and now." The creature turned toward Eve, its empty eyes glowing ominously. She felt the cold of the fog more strongly than ever, yet she faced the darkness, her blade ready, and waited for the right moment to strike. Eve tightened her fist around the dagger, her eyes fixed on the condensing creature. The fog slowed her movements and tried to influence her thoughts. She knew she had to deliver one final decisive blow before the darkness swallowed them all. "Distracted," she called to the woman and the young man, her voice sharp. She knew they had to combine their strength to have any chance at all. The young man hesitated only briefly before running at the creature with a battle cry. His axe whirled through the air before striking the creature directly in its flickering form. The blow made the shape stagger, and the shadows around it fell into chaos for a moment. The woman, braver than before, swung her improvised weapon with such force that a rumbling sound arose when it struck the creature. A scream threaded with anger and pain escaped the figure as it warped and lost its form for a moment. Yet then it gathered itself again, faster and more dangerous than before. Eve knew this was her only chance. She lunged forward, guiding her blade in a precise motion. The dagger slid through the pulsing center of the creature, the place that glowed brightest. A piercing, deafening sound filled the alley as the figure began to tremble in pain. "Back!" Eve shouted as she rolled away from the convulsing creature. The others followed her call and sought shelter behind a half-collapsed wall. The fog around the creature began to whirl in an uncontrolled vortex before bursting apart with a loud crash. The alley grew silent. The fog had withdrawn, and the threatening presence of the creature had vanished. Eve rose, her legs trembling, and she felt the exertion of the fight pulling at her. The dagger in her hand was warm, as though it had absorbed the creature's force. The young man looked at her with wide eyes. "You did it," he gasped, his voice a mixture of relief and awe. "We did it," Eve corrected, and looked at the woman who still clutched her improvised weapon. "That was a fight we won together." Yet her words could not fill the silence that now lay over them. She knew this was only a small victory. The shadows had not disappeared, and the fog, though pushed back, would soon reclaim its place. The small child she had rescued from the trap still crouched by the wall. Eve knelt down to be at eye level with her. "It is over," she said gently, but the child did not move. She seemed absent, her eyes staring into nothing. "What is wrong with her?" the woman asked, her voice filled with concern. "I do not know," Eve admitted. "But we cannot leave her here. Something has touched her, and perhaps one day we will know how to help." The woman nodded hesitantly, and the young man handed Eve a blanket he pulled from his bundle. She wrapped the child carefully and lifted her. Despite the cold of the fog, the girl was warm, as though she carried some strange force of her own inside her. "We have to keep moving," Eve said firmly. "To the workshop. There we can catch our breath and decide what comes next." The group set itself in motion once more, exhausted, but carrying a spark of hope. The streets of the city remained silent, yet the shadows lurking in the windows of the buildings reminded Eve that this was no longer a safe place. Every decision, every step mattered, and the fog would not stop until it had swallowed everything.